The goal for this video is to add a Debug UI for our game where we can print any value or property to test it in real time. First, we create a new scene that will hold our Debug UI nodes. The scene will contain a root control node, a panel container node, and a VBox container node. As we add properties, we'll create new label control nodes procedurally as children of our VBox container. Create a new script and attach it to the parent debug node. I'm going to add this debug scene to my main scene controller. Your setup might be a bit different if you're not following the tutorial series, but basically I want the debug scene to be low on my scene tree so that it is layered above other scenes in the tree. We're going to reference this debug script using our global script Autoload. Doing this will allow us to access our debug functions from anywhere. In my global script, I add a debug variable for my debug class name. In our debug script, we create that class name and the following variables and constant. A properties array that will hold any debug labels we create, a reference to our VBox container node. I'm using the onReady reference technique, but you can also use an export variable reference. Then a constant that will reference our frame time in milliseconds. I'm going to explain why this is here in a minute, but basically, like you can in Unreal, I want to be able to set how often the debug property updates. There may be times where you only want it to update every second and not every frame. In our ready function, we access our global autoload and set the debug variable reference to self and set visible to false. We'll want a way to toggle our debug panel UI off and on, so we need to add an input button. I've added a debug event in the input map with the tilde key. We use the input function to check if the event pressed is the debug event, and if it is, we set visible to not visible. This may look a little odd, but it's an easy way to basically flip-flop our Boolean value every time we press the debug key. Then we need to add get viewport set input as handled to count the input event as read. Godot's input system flows through an input tree, and our key input will get read by other functions in that tree further down if we don't tell the engine that we considered it handled. Hence, we add this line. Then we create a new function, add debug property. This function is what we'll use to create new debug properties in our UI and other scripts. We need a few parameters, an ID name, the value we want to pass along, and a time in frames for how often we want to update the value. The else statement will get run the first time the function is called. We create a new label node, add that label node as a child to our VBox container, set the name to our ID, and the label text to our ID plus our value. Notice we're converting our value to a string because labels require strings and won't accept things like floats or integers. Then we add our new property ID to our properties array so we can check for it in the next frame. In our if statement, we check our properties array to see if it contains our previously created ID name. If it does, we don't want to create another label. We want to update the existing one. So we set our target by finding the child of the container that equals the ID name. And then we set our text value again with our new updated value. This is going to update our debug property value every frame. Finally, I added another if statement here to check for our time in frames. The idea is to set the number of frames we want to update this value when we run our function. These functions will be called in our physics process functions and other scripts, so they'll be capped at 60 frames per second. If we use a value of 1, that means we'll update this every 1 frame. If we use 60, we'll update it every 60 frames or every second. To do this, we check if the total milliseconds elapsed divided by our FPS MS value, which is 16, divided by our time in frames has a remainder of 0. If it does, then we update our value. It might be a little crude, but I did feel that it was better than creating a bunch of different timers that might run every frame. You should now be able to call this function in any physics process function to debug any property from any script.